in order for the city council to be able to assess impact fees. And so we are just in that process, and in that process, the committee and the council wanted to make sure that all of the stakeholders had the information that they needed. We had your input in what you thought about those, what some of you have developed in other places and had experiences. We wanted to see that. The council hired Kimley Horn to do the technical part of this that has to be done as part of those steps in that process. And we'll let John and Jeff talk to you a little bit about what they did. But each of you were sent, as part of your invitation, the presentation that the committee has been going through for the last several months. I think our first meeting was in February. Sarah, is that right? November, gosh, even before Christmas. But we started organizing then and have been actively going through the different steps, understanding. You also were sent references or links to the 3 master plans that are an integral part of how we got here. Those master plans are for the water master plan for the city of Odessa, the sewer master plan, and then the transportation plan. And what those plans did is outline the needs based on growth assumptions. We looked at those growth assumptions with Kimley Horn. They developed them. We ratified them, if you will, said yes, those are reasonable numbers. I think Gus, I don't know if you've seen those, but I think they're fit very closely with what Encore and Atlas and some of them have been projecting also as far as the growth for Odessa. So all of those things show what we're going to need, the capital needs that we'll have for the growth that we're projected to have in the community. And we look at it in 10-year bites. So we're looking at what's going to happen in 10 years. In 10 years, we need about $350 million worth of capital improvements in the growth area, inside the city and within the growth area for Odessa. That's a big number any way you look at it. Impact fees are only one tool in the way to help finance a portion of that $350 million. They're the conventional things, the things the city's been doing. Dr. Goetz and Philly have shared their past experiences on how they've done it. Cindy's done a wonderful job, because we kept asking her, how did we do this in the past? Show us how it was done in the past. So we've looked at all the different ways that the city has financed projects in the past. The water and sewer fund, the general fund, bond elections, certificates of obligations. Impact fees is just another possible way to do that, to add to that pie of ability to fund projects. So I'm not trying to oversell it or undersell it, just give you a little bit of background. I think everybody understands that. I hope you do. If you don't, we'll answer some questions. We've got a lot of folks from city staff that are here. Tom Tier, Irvon and Hal from Public Works, Philly. City manager was here a minute ago, Michael. Oh, okay. He ducked out. All right, but no problem. We'll find him if you have a question for him. Anyway, I'm just going to open this up. We can go through this whole presentation again. We've got it. Y'all probably have all seen it. So I'm going to turn it over to Kimley Horn, let them kind of give you a summary of some of the things, and then we can get to the back of the, real quickly go through how we got, but go to the back of your handout, which is comparing us to our neighboring city and discuss some of those things. So I think that's a lot of what people want us asked about, but nothing's off the table. Anybody can ask any questions they want to tonight or any comments. So let it go with there.
Thanks, John. Can y'all hear me okay? How many of y'all had a chance to look at the packet? I kind of want to get a gauge of how detailed I should go through the presentation. This meeting's for you. We want to make sure that you all get the information you need and focus on the questions you want to focus. So if I'm going too long on one of these, let me know. Or if you need more information, please stop me. Or if you have questions as I go along, let me know. What we plan to cover today was the role of the CIAC Council. John did a good job outlining the role, so we'll touch that briefly. We're going to go through the process. Pretty much what we're trying to catch this group up on is about 6-7 months of work to get you where we are. We'll go through the concepts, the land use assumptions and capital plan, the study itself, and then dive into probably the meat of what most people are interested in is what is the results and the comparisons. So the Capital Improvements Advisory Committee was formed, as John mentioned, with the members he had. They have really two main responsibilities. One is during the study, they're our advisory group. They give us input on the land use assumptions and CIP, and they'll give us input on the actual fees that we collect. Also, if the impact fees were to be adopted, their advisory committee throughout the process, they're our monitoring committee, if you will. They're going to monitor us every 6 months and see what's been collected and how it's been spent. They're basically there to advise us and file semi-annual reports. The City Council, they too review the land use assumptions, impact fees, and capital improvement plan. They consider the comments by the CIAC, and they may enact the impact fees, and they may consider the recommendations that the CIAC, the Capital Improvements Advisory Committee, brings to them. So the process, we kind of say there's 4 steps to this process. There's the planning steps. That's the land use assumptions and capital improvements plan. That's a lot of the assumptions that are built in, and we'll talk about that in a minute. There's the analysis step. That's the calculations. That's the what dollar do we need, and that's where we are in the process. The next step is probably what some people consider the most important part of the process. That's the policy step. That's the decisions. Really, what rate are you going to collect? Are you going to adopt impact fees? That's really the policy step. And lastly is the adoption. That's the ordinance to enact the policy step. So the concepts. For those who are not familiar with impact fees, it's a one-time fee for new development. The key to that is once in new development. So this only impacts new impacts to the system. So for example, if you have an existing home and you tear down the existing home to build a new home, that home was already there. There's no new impacts. The only change would be like if you decide to change your water meter to a bigger meter, there might be some impacts on that. But in theory, there's no impacts to that change. So it's for new development. It's a mechanism to recover costs required to serve that future development. So the whole purpose of our study is to understand if you build a new development, how much demand on the infrastructure is that. And so that's really the purpose. What is the cost of that infrastructure? And then the policy step is how do you divide that cost among however you choose to do it with the tools in the toolbox. Really important, it's really the only legal way to collect a flexible fee for infrastructure. And the real key I put on that is flexible. And why is that important? It gives the city somewhat of the freedom to prioritize the projects along with the input of the Capital Improvements Advisory Committee and the City Council to prioritize the projects where the projects make sense. A lot of other structures and ordinances make you build something where it may not make sense. This is a way you can actually apply the fee to an area where it makes sense. So Texas, just a little bit of state law right here, allows 4 impact fees: water, wastewater, roadway, and drainage. But we're only talking about water, wastewater, and roadway today. Drainage we're not talking about. But those are the only 4 impact fees that are allowed by Texas statute. So what can we pay with impact fees and can we not pay with impact fees? The short answer is anything that produces additional capacity. What we're talking about is growth paying for growth. So growth has 2 impacts. We want to be able to accommodate that new capacity. So what that means is we cannot use impact fees to remedy existing deficiencies, maintenance operations. That pothole in front of your house, can't use impact fees to fill that pothole. It has to be a widening of the road, an upsize of a water line, a new lift station, something that's increasing the capacity of the system. So that's the key word to remember. The other thing to remember is we can use impact fees to pay for engineering services, right-of-way acquisition. We can also use it to pay for debt service. Many of these large infrastructure projects are funded through debt service. You can pay back the debt service with impact fees. So the land use assumptions. Any questions on the general impact fee concept before I move on to some of the technical data? So it's a relatively simple concept, a lot of details, the complexes in the So when we were thinking of the land use assumptions, we go back to your comprehensive plan, a vision of Odessa. That's the framework for the land use assumptions. A vision of Odessa did not have exactly everything laid out to the study area. So we took the vision of Odessa and laid that out parcel by parcel to the study area, and we called that the ultimate land use. So we took the vision that was made in the comp plan to land that to the land use plan. What we found out, just some interesting facts, I kind of like interesting facts, is what's the city's land use made up of? Half of it's residential. That's pretty common when you look across the city, half of the city being residential. 35% of it's non-residential. 13.2% is public rights of way. I think that's always an interesting number I like to see, is that when you actually look at the transportation system predominantly, that's about 13% of the city. It's just an interesting fact when you actually look at the ultimate land use of the city. So when we started diving into what are the growth assumptions, we looked back at Envision Odessa, and the line that stuck out to us was projections for Envision Odessa take a conservative approach of an estimated 1% CAGR over the plan's 20-year period. So that's what Envision Odessa in 2016 was thinking, 1% growth. We also have been working on the master plans for 2019, and during that process, the water, wastewater, and transportation master plan all use the same assumptions. Looking at Envision Odessa, but we drove a little bit deeper. So we divided the city into these 4 sections. Part of the city, you can imagine, is growing faster than other parts of the city. So in the northern part of the city, we had a 3 and 4% growth, while in the southern part of the city, it was a 0.5% or 0.75% growth. And what that came out to was 1.3% growth. So if you think about Envision Odessa, it's at a conservative 1%, but we're at 1.3%. It's pretty in line with what Envision Odessa's projected. But this growth is what was actually used in the master planning process in 2019. One concept that I want to make sure that's clear on, can be somewhat confusing if you haven't dealt with impact fees, is the concept of service areas. What service areas are, it's a funding area where you spend money into a funding area and it benefits projects in that funding area. So the way you look at it is if you're in a service and you spend money, it goes towards projects in that service area. It's pretty easy for water and wastewater because there's one service area for water and wastewater. If you think about the systems on a closed system, and everything's one, if you build something over here, it's benefiting something over there. So it's really one service area for water and wastewater. For roadway, we have to divide the city up because of state law. So we have multiple service areas. We'll show you the 3 service areas for roadway. So on those roadway service areas, the important thing to remember is if you've got money in one of those service areas, you have to spend in projects in that service area. Or the city will have to spend it on projects in that service area. So this is the map for the roadway service areas.
Got a question real quick.
Sure.
I know it's a hot topic a little bit, but annexation, can you kind of walk through what that would look like if possible with annex? It's not a surface area.
Sure. The annexations, it kind of depends. We're in that policy phase. There's some different ways we can handle annexation. There are different cities choose to handle it differently. Some of it require a map update. It's a simple procedure to come to the city to say, if it's less than, some cities have an ordinance, if it's less than 10 acres annexation, it could be an automatic map update to the nearest service area. If it's greater than 10 acres, you have to actually go through like the update process. So we haven't gotten to that discussion, but as of right now, if you're on roadway impact fees, if you're not in the service area as currently written, there wouldn't be an impact fee, but we would have to have discussions on how we handle annexation. Very good question. Water, not confined to the city limits. So water and wastewater may not have the same annexation questions that roadway would. And this is the service area for water and wastewater. Very similar boundaries for water and wastewater. When you flip through the 2, you can see kind of the slight differences. But these are the assumptions for the water and wastewater area. The capital improvements plan, the water impact fee CIP, these are based on your water master plan. So if you look at the water master plan and look at the water impact fee CIP, you're going to see a lot of similarities between the two. We identified 25 projects across the city for water projects, and similar for wastewater, 20 projects identified for over the next 10 years. Roadway is a little different. As I mentioned, there's 3 different project lists. And on roadway, we looked at widening projects, which are roads that exist today that we're adding lanes to. We looked at new projects, intersection projects, and some corridor projects. So service area 1, this is the roadway list for service area 1. Service area 2, as you can imagine, is kind of the more developed area of the city. There's less roadway projects, but there's more intersection projects. We commonly see that in areas where they're more developed. We'll see more intersection projects because you can add capacity through improving an intersection. In Service Area 3, this is an area where we see a lot more new projects. A lot of new projects that come along to help support growth, the roads that are needed to support those new developments. All those water, wastewater, and roadway CIPs and land use assumptions, they correspond very closely to the 2019 master plans. So that was our North Star for this. Diving into the study a little bit, one of the important concepts for you to know is a term called service units. For water and wastewater, that's pretty common. Most of y'all are in the building environment. Your service unit is meter size. So defined as a base meter of 3/4 inch. So that's important to remember. When we did our study, we assumed a base meter of 3/4 inch, and that's what for water and wastewater, based on meter size. For roadway, it's a little more complicated. You may not have dealt with it as much. It's a term called vehicle miles. It's basically defined as one trip travels 1 mile. And we'll show you some examples of how that calculation works. So just a quick example, 3/4 inch meter might be single family house, 2 inch meter, shopping center. Or you can think of it as 2 inch equals 5 1/3, 3/4 inch meters. So when you think about when you pull a 2 inch meter, you would pay that 5 1/3 times as a 3/4 inch meter. Or a shopping center pays 5 times the house. Roadway service units, there's 2 variables. I'm a traffic engineer by trade, and so people who don't know that these books exist, there's actually a book out there that tells you on different land uses how much trips you generate. It's actually used to be a book, it's online now, but it's 3 volumes and it's a lot of great data. But that's what we use to figure out how much trips something's generated. It's based on data. And then how many of y'all fill out the National Household Travel Survey? Have y'all ever seen that? You get those surveys from the federal government and go, what's my information used for? If you filled out the census, very similar. Well, we use that information to understand trip length. How far is someone traveling on average to go somewhere? So we utilize these 2 sources to come up with that information. And there's some legal requirements on trip length in Chapter 395. We're capped on the trip length into 395. So probably some of y'all see the trip length for a house. Like, I might travel farther than that, but we have a cap based on the state law. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. This is the most math you'll do tonight, I hope. Single family home generates 0.99 trips in the PM peak. So if you think about coming home like during an hour period, probably maybe one of you come home during an hour period. On average, 1 trip per house, 0.99. Travels, the trip length, we're capped by state law at 3 miles. So the trip length we're using for single family home in the case of Odessa, we're using 3 mile trip length. So 0.99 times 3 miles is 2.97 vehicle miles. You won't ever have to remember that if impact fees are implemented. This would be baked into the equation, but we wanted to open up the hood to show you how it's made. So a single family home would generate 2.97 vehicle miles. So that's a number we might reference a little bit later. So roughly 3 vehicle miles per single family house. Very similar on the shopping center. Per 1,000 square feet, it generates 3.81 trips per 1,000 square feet. But not all those trips are for the shopping center. Like if you're on your way home, you might stop and get a bottle of milk or something. So that's called a pass-by trip. We don't actually chart trips for pass-by trips. So on an average shopping center, about 1/3 of the trips, there's your bar trivia for tonight, is about 1/3 of the trips going to a shopping center are just passing by. So that goes to 2.51, similar 3 mile trip length for a total of 7.53 vehicle miles. That's just the calculation of how we calculate the service units for vehicle miles. There's about 60 different land uses. And the idea behind that is you get as close to the trips generated as the land use as possible. These are just 2 of the common examples. So now the calculation, the fun part. We looked at the total impact fee CIP. So when you think about it, you saw those 25 and 20 projects, that's a lot of projects with a lot of dollars. So for water, that's 55 million. And for wastewater, that was 89 million. Well, we can only recover what's associated with growth. So only a portion of those projects are associated with growth. So when you think about the growth that's happening, each project has a growth, an existing cost potentially, a growth cost, and a beyond the 10-year growth cost. So for water, roughly we're recovering about 10% of that total CIP cost from growth. So if you think about the number, it's 5 million, 5.176 million. That's the total recoverable cost. We add financing costs to that because it costs money to borrow money to build those projects. But we also gain some interest on the money we earn because we're borrowing that. So subtracting interest, we actually give credit for the ad valorem taxes and utility revenue because you're paying taxes as you come in. So really the number that matters is 5.9 million. So 5.9 million on the water side is what the impact fee growth over 10 years we think is associated with growth. Then we divide by the service units, which is the growth, to get 75, 79, which comes out to $778 per base meter. So that's the impact fee per base meter for water. Similar equation for wastewater. Your needs are a little bit higher on the wastewater side than the water side. So you see the fee is the dollar amount slightly higher for the wastewater side. We do a similar calculation for roadways. Very similar. Service area 1, 2, and 3 have a total CIP cost. We break that CIP cost down to what's recoverable in the 10-year window. Add financing, subtract interest, subtract ad valorem taxes to get to the total recoverable cost. So roughly the 10-year cost on the roadway side is 28 million in service area 1, divided by 10,459 service units to get 2726 in service area 1, 1240 in service area 2, and 2155 in service area 1. One thing you'll notice on roadway that might be a little different, you see the service units are higher. They're in vehicle miles, but that also represents a lot of commercial. Commercial generates more vehicle miles than residential. So these are important numbers to remember. So I'm a very visual map person, so I like to see it in map style. So if you think about the summary, what's the takeaway? What's the executive summary of the report? We do all this work to get down to really 5 numbers in the case of Odessa. $778 per base meter for citywide, $1662 per base meter for wastewater citywide. And then we have the 3 numbers on roadway that you see in front of you. That was a very fast version of our impact fee study. If you read the impact fee study, that covers everything, and now we're going to get things outside the impact fee study.
So those are the maximum numbers allowed by the state.
Like the comment was, those are the maximum numbers. So our job in studying is to determine what is the maximum accessible fee. So this is the cap that the city could choose to charge. They can charge anywhere from 0 to what we just calculated. So we are just calculating the growth and the cost of growth. That was a great comment. Any other questions as we move on? Any discussion, Chris?
Nobody had edited this, so feel free to let me know. On the CIP list, any of the projects in funded, are there funding to reduce some of the projects that may have been funded, and what's already there? Just kind of curiosity, have any of those projects funded?
Some of the projects have been funded at this time.
Right now, it's a little more specific. Yeah, I think,
Fodry.
we had partial funding identified, and non-active, those are primary structures.
In line P, and a portion of 61st Street has been built too.
There's a handful on there.
Okay, I got a question about 61st Street. If the impact fee goes into effect, I currently have been building 61st Street, so I will not have to contribute anything to 61st Street for its impact, correct?
Depends on the policy discussion. If you're building the road, you receive an impact fee credit. So you might be required to build the road, but you wouldn't pay the impact fee. You would receive credits for the impact fee otherwise do. The idea behind the impact fee is to get infrastructure built. So in the cases of many communities, is there some people who are building roadways, but there's some developers who are not building roadways. So the thought is the ones that are building roadways. If you're building arterial infrastructure now, and let me make a clarification, is there's a clarification between site roadways and system roadways. Roads and water lines, there are system roadways that are on the thoroughfare plan, and then the site roadways are the local streets that you build to serve inside your development. So if you're building a system roadway, you will receive credit towards your impact fees otherwise do. In most cases, if you're building a significant roadway, you're probably not going to get credit for most of your impact fees. You have to do the calc, how much does the road cost versus how much your roadways are.
Well, some of the time, especially in water and wastewater projects, and making money, those kind of things, I'm going to see some of that being included in the CIP. projects.
Chris,
I need to restate that.
Yeah.
I was trying to get a better understanding, more on the water and wastewater projects that have been funded. Those also have indicators associated with those. I have trouble understanding why some of those projects are, I get the concept because the city wants to pay out debt and get that part of it. But for developers to be taxed on those items, I just want to get a little better understanding of that.
Well, if you go back to the calculation details, I'll actually put it here. The credit for ad valorem taxes is, that is taking some of the value that's built into the current rates and subtracting that out of this value. So it's, as if a developer and a homeowner ends up paying a portion of the impact fees, there's been a deduction of that impact fee. So when they start paying their rates, they aren't double dipped, if you will. Is that, it's a nuance in the
And I
process.
think if I remember correctly, it's Line P is the one, was that funded after we started in the city? So I think some of it may have been, there's always a magic line on when something is funded and something doesn't. So as we were building this CIP, I don't believe it was funded yet. So there's always been overlap on how things get funded. But I think it's just one project, if I remember correctly, that has that overlap.
You kind of know from the other conversation.
Yes.
Just trying to figure out ways from the developer perspective to help keep those impact fees low. So by maybe looking at those CIP projects, I guess my question, when you actually discuss this, does that need to be in there?
Yeah, the thing we run into here is that project's built to go way beyond the 10-year window. It's that line P for that eastern half of the city is built to not only serve the next 10 years, but it's actually to serve that entire area in perpetuity. So there's a level of oversizing, if you will, that goes beyond the 10 years. We do discount for current capacity that's going to go into the pipeline the day it goes into service. The dollar amount associated with that is already pulled out of the cost.
And the best way to example that is if you look at the total CIP, it's 55 million. The cost we're including is 5 million for the growth costs.
Not to get into too much detail, but that's funded, right? And I know there's contingency on funding.
That funding was average the city relative to a revenue source that it had, and the city signed those dollars with the dollars from initially that was signed.
We're currently putting in a half a mile of plumbing, water line, sewer line, so that we can charge impact fees on that, just for paying for all that time.
Well, every project's a little different, but I don't know the details. Tom might know the details on that project, but like commonly you have oversized participation. A lot of times on that oversized participation, you'll receive credits towards your oversized participation. So now this gives a funding source, if you will, for the city to say, we're participating in your oversized participation for your line through impact fee credits, so you don't have to pay.
It does depend on which 12-inch water line we're building.
And also your development a little bit. If your development, fully takes up all that, there's a little bit of factor, but generally speaking, I was trying to answer the question.
A lot of the impact fee projects that you see up here are much larger than the program line. We're talking 24-inch line, for minor fee, we're talking 54 and 48-inch line. And generally, the developer's not building those in. When you're talking 8 wells, developer is required to at least put in an 8-inch line, and then the 12 is the oversized. That one. But if you pay for the whole line, you can take those credits and apply eventually to your impact.
What is the credit?
So we've been using the term credit. It's when you build something, you build up a bank, if you will. So if you are building a roadway and the road costs, say, $1 million, you now have a bank with the city for $1 million of an impact fee eligible project. And when, as you pull your building permit, one thing we didn't probably elaborate in 101 is the impact fees due a water meter and water meter permit and the building permit. When you pull that building permit, you basically, they're charging you for the impact fee that's coming from your bank in the city.
Basically, the credit means you don't pay an impact fee. If you build one of the pieces of infrastructure on here, it's on this impact fee capital improvement plan. Let's say you want it built much quicker than the city's timeline is, and you build that infrastructure, then you don't pay the impact fees for that. That's what credit means.
Sometimes we use the term offset.
Because the city you have now built a portion of that infrastructure for the city. It was on the plan.
So if I build some of these arterial roads just on the paper, I will have bank credits, and I might not ever have to have any kind of fee.
Potentially, yes.
We can do it on.
But Larry, I think this is where we have a unique case because Larry doesn't pull building permits. Mr. McKnight sitting behind him is the guy that's gonna go get the building permit on the lot. So how do he transfer his credits to the lots that Mr. McKnight's gonna buy? That's part of the complication, right?
Well, the credits will actually tie to the plat. So as you do a plat, and you, as a condition of development approval on the plat, if you're building a roadway, it would be tied to the land, so they would run with the land.
You're going to tie it to the flag and not to the water.
Not to the what?
Water.
It's tied to the plat, but when we calculate the collection when you get to water. But the
So I don't
assessment,
get water. I don't get water.
well then, yeah, it's not assessed to you, then it's assessed to everybody.
Yeah, but I pay the road.
Right, this is not a common question. We have a developer who's selling to a builder. And so there's multiple ways to do it. The way most cities do it, it goes into the land price. So now there's a credit that the builder of a property that now no longer has to pay an impact fee because a road was built on this property. So therefore, there's value in that. That's how most cities handle it. There are some cities handle it that you could be reimbursed by having the builder pay the impact fee through an agreement and pay back to the developer. I don't recommend that because it's a lot of paperwork in the city and a lot of paperwork in the development. But basically, the person who's pulling the building permit on the land, so the credits run with the land.
So I let the city build the roads and then let it impact the
Good. Yes.
There's a certain responsibility that's already. There's a certain responsibility in the ordinance that is developers to begin with, and that would be, say like the oversizing. The 8-inch part of the line is the developer's responsibility. And so 20 feet, if you're on residential, 20 feet of the roadway is on that side of the street is the developer's responsibility. Those still occur. This is for the remainder of the street. So say the 24-foot in the middle and sometimes but anyway, that portion would be the portion that is accessible in terms of impact.
Yeah, so what Tom is saying, I'll try to interpret it, is there's really a 3-step process, really a 2-step process. I won't confuse the 3rd step, is what does the subdivision ordinance require for you to do? That's not changing. We're not recommending the subdivision ordinance change. The second thing is, if you do the things inside the subdivision ordinance, are you eligible for impact fee credits? That's what we're adding now, is if the subdivision ordinance tells you to build a road, that road might make you eligible for impact fee credits. We're not saying that you can just choose to pay the impact fee and not do the subdivision ordinance requirements.
Well, it's arterial roads, not subdivision.
Well, the subdivision ordinance could require arterial roads to be constructed.
It does, there's that much.
I just said it does. Yes, it does. Yes. If you build a road that's an arterial, you're going to receive the credits too. I just wanted to clarify. I didn't want to make there was any confusion that you could make the option to just pay the impact fee and not build the road if the subdivision ordinance requires it, or the development code. I don't know if those reasons. That was a great question.
Larry, I think what's missing in the conversation is you're gonna build, let's say, a 24-inch water line that needs to go through there. Historically, you would get a participation from the city. The city will probably now go to giving you impact fee credits for that oversize as opposed to giving you a reimbursement. Then it falls on you to talk to your clients, if you're selling lots, to recover those credit costs for the people who sell your lots.
So I can use the credit anywhere else. Right?
I think we ran into the problem. I think it's,
With the plat, the plat.
Criteria.
it has to be on the project.
We can define that in the ordinance as we work through that. It's tied to the plat, but we can also tie it to a master plan. So you can't necessarily use, it has to be a nexus between the two. So we usually make the nexus a plat or a master plan, but we can define that in the ordinance, like what they're trying to restrict is you can't do a credit, like say on the northwest side of town, and apply it to the southeast side of town, but within the same contiguous master plan. So,
Roadway, are you restricted to the?
and you're restricted to the service areas on the roadway, yes. But
My next question is, how much you been trying to get out of the on your license?
yeah, well, maybe we can just go into the comparison slides, but is there any other questions on the CIP? These are great questions. This is what we want to answer.
Sounds like it's almost a zero sum game. Put down the money in credits, but the homeowner is getting water meters. It's multiple paid. Is that correct?
The person who pulls the building permit of the water meters will pay for it.
So how is that being done right now? Does it exist? Does it just be additional income?
This goes back to the question that this gentleman, or the comment this gentleman raised, is it probably goes down to how lots are sold and the value of the credits that are associated with that. So impact the discussion a little bit. Any other questions? This is going to get into the comparison between Midland and walking through some graphs. I think that you want to hear and kind of see some thought process. There hasn't been a recommendation formally made. What you'll see is just a strict comparison to what Midland's charging, the process they went through. So we're going to outline that because that's what this group and our CIC is tasked to do, is help provide us some comments and some recommendations. We're providing data. So the data we've been asked to provide at this point in time is if we use the same ideology as Midland, what would our impact fees look like? So that's what we're going to present to you today. Sure, let's jump to it. So this is the first chart, and I'm only showing you this chart to know just a comparison. This is the chart between Midland and Odessa that shows the calculation, the maximum impact. I won't spend a lot of time on this chart, but what you'll see, a little bit unique in Odessa, there was more need on the wastewater side based on the calculations in Odessa than what's shown in Midland. But Midland had a larger need on the water side. Yeah, I'll explain. That's a good point. Blue is water. That's the maximum impact fee from water. The green is wastewater, and the orange is roadway. For a 1-inch meter. That's important to note. One thing I'll note with you is, you recall I said Odessa used a 3/4 inch meter for the base meter. Midland used a 1-inch meter. So to compare apples to apples, we're showing a 1-inch meter in this case. So you'll see that the water and wastewater is a little bit higher than I showed you before. We'll show you again later. We just wanted to compare apples to Midland. So this is based on a base meter, 1-inch meter. Odessa's would be a smaller meter than that, so the fee would be less when we show you that comparison. But this is apples to apples. If Odessa, Midland compared to each other.
Maximum allowed by law.
Maximum allowed by law. Then what Midland adopted is 50% of the maximum. So this takes that 1-inch meter, cuts it in half. Essentially is what it does. We get to a little bit more details in a second about how they handle residential, but this is what they adopted in Midland. Basically taking what was calculated and cutting it in half. The next slide is Midland also through policy. Remember I talked about the process we're in? We've done the planning, we've done the analysis, we're on the policy stage. So that half adoption was a policy, but they also decided to give a 25% housing credit to townhomes, single family, and duplexes. Not multifamily, but the lower density residential. So at a 25% discount. So if we would compare Midland to Odessa, blue being water, green being wastewater, orange being roadway, with the 50% credit or the 50% cut, with the 25% housing reduction, which is what Midland did, this is the values that we see here. But remember, this is a 1-inch meter. So this is based on 1-inch meter. And for the home builders here, you know what meter size you pull, so just remember this is based on 1-inch meter. And that's important to remember. So you can see if you compare Odessa to Midland, for service area 1, 3,900.
Change slide.
Oh, John got me quick here. This is the base meter. So this is the 1-inch meter in Midland compared to the 3/4 inch meter in Odessa. So you can see that this, we showed all the first ones with the 1-inch meter. This shows the 3/4 inch meter. So this isn't exactly a recommendation, but this would be like, if you took the base meter, what Midland did, and took the base meter from our study in Odessa, how would they compare? These would be the rates. So if we took their methodology, so if you were to build a house in service area 1 in Odessa, which is, it would be an extra $39.51 for the 3 different impact fees. Service area 2, $22.96, and service area 3, $33.15. Compared to Midland's, between $34.41 and $41.56. So this is just a comparison, just taking the exact same logic Midland did and applying to Odessa. If there was a motion on the table that said, hey, we would do exactly what Midland did, this would probably be the results of that policy decision. So this is what we got.
$4,000 add to the cost of every house you build.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Basically $4,000 to every house you build.
Yeah, I mean, if you round up to basically, And service area 1 would be $39.51. Other service area side of us.
That's the builder that has to pay that, is that correct?
It would be paid at building permit or pull the water meter.
Now, and Mark, that's for a 3/4 inch meter, so it's did an inch meter or an inch and a half.
It would be the previous slide.
Right. From inch meter.
And now one thing to remember is, a lot of single family, we see more commonly in single family homes that they build arterial infrastructure more commonly than commercial development. It's more common to see because you need the roads to serve a single family development. So if you were to build a road, an arterial roadway, you would get credit towards this too otherwise. So y'all know your developments now, and you can kind of do the math of if I built that road, how much that road costs, how many units I had, and kind of see, am I going to pay any that or not? A lot of times when we see large single family developments, like large, several hundred units of single family developments, we often see a lot of, the cost to build the road sometimes cancels out or credits out the impact fee costs.
Would it cancel out across the full spectrum of impact fees, or would it just go for the road?
It would just go to the roads for the roadway. So for the water and wastewater, they're all separate. Good point, John.
Putting up for the developers that sell to builders. If I'm a developer, and I'm building an arterial road, I'm not just gonna assess that $4,000, because that's my risk. I'm gonna be paying that $1 million loan for that arterial. So that trickle down to the builders can be more than just that, most likely. There's probably not too many developers that's that cost straight on. No risk.
That was,
Oh, you stop.
we got, that was the single family hard, and obviously, Chris, you have some stories, maybe if you want to share about your credit agreements in Midland, et cetera, but we look for questions or comments.
As builders in Midland see the downturn since they enacted required for the funds, some buyers can't afford it. But you had to pass it along. You had to pay it along.
Lumber's been a lot more happening.
I mean, when Midland had the impact fees, they didn't have all the lumber prices. It's got up 2 or 3 times. So Midland, we absorbed the impact fee first, and then with all the lumber pricing and the pricing, it might be a little bit different, but I'm not an economist. I'm not first of all broken. I would imagine with the lumber and steel prices, now we had more, it's just
We usually have less people than 45 hours.
I'm assuming it's gonna be a little bit more difficult.
We can show you some examples. We talked a lot about single family, but we felt it appropriate to show you some examples of some other types of developments. As you can think, as I showed my land use, one of the things I showed the land use at the beginning is you have 50% single family and 35% non-residential. So in a perfect world, your trips are half residential, half non-residential. Well, if you think about the impact of that and how much residential you have versus non-residential from units, the non-residential per unit tends to be a little bit higher trip rates. So just think about going to your HEB. HEB generates a lot more trips than your house. How many houses does HEB generate? So I'm gonna show you multifamily. These are at 50% of the max. We were just comparing to Midland's adopted fees. So this is based on a 1.5 inch meter and 250 units. So it's important for multifamily, it's per unit. So when you looked at Odessa Area 1, and this is just with the 50% credit, multifamily of 250 units, 453,000. I always like to tell anecdotal stories. I've worked on the private side as much as I've worked on the public side. I've worked for developers as much as I've worked for cities, a better way to say it. A $453,000 impact fee for multifamily is about the cost of, maybe a little bit more. It's the cost of a traffic signal and turn lane. So I've worked with a lot of multifamily units that have to put in a traffic signal turn lane. So they get credit toward, in that case, they would get credit toward impact fees. If they don't put anything in, they would pay that fee. That's just an anecdotal element of working on that. There's the fee varies by service area compared to actually what Midland's charging. So this is just, remember, I'm just comparing exactly what Midland's charging. We're not making a recommendation here. So this is multifamily, 250 units. The next example, same comparison. This is general office, 1 inch meter, 5,000 square feet. Odessa versus Midland. Kind of your garden office. We switch to light industrial, 3 inch meter, 50,000 square feet. This is a retail shopping center, 10,000 square feet, 2 inch meter. As you can see, the water and wastewater meter probably doesn't move the needle quite as much as maybe the transportation side. The meter size of the water needs on non-residential are not as big as the transportation needs.
Yeah. Well, one thing is really had come from Joe gave some specific example of HEB and a specific line office complex. Don't like that, no, I'm commercial people over there. The HEB was pretty drastic, our time, kind of stuff, and 2 different uses.
Yeah, we haven't pulled what Chris is asking is specific sites that have developed in Odessa and how that would rate. We could definitely do that if there's some specific sites. We could run this number pretty easily and tell you what that would be. What he suggested, HEB is a weird animal. Is it a supermarket or is it a shopping center? So there's different ways to calculate the fee. So what we showed in another community was here's how you calculate that fee based on roadway, and some of those are policy decisions that we have to walk through. And a lot of good perspective. They're all roads, correct. They did not adopt water wastewater, correct. Correct. That's correct. And then someone asked a question earlier about how much revenue do we think we could collect, and I was getting there. So this is the revenue. The first column is the revenue if we adopted exactly what Midland did. We would anticipate about $4 million a year. If we would adopt at 50%, so remove that residential credit I talked about, that would be about 4.5 million. And if we just collected the maximum impact fee, obviously it's double the 50%, so 9 million. With the need that has been calculated for Midland, someone mentioned earlier, I think $350 million over 10 years. So that's at $35 million. So if we adopted exactly what the study said, the maximum rate we could actually collect, based on all the assumptions, would be 9.1 million out of the 3,500 million needs. And those are the two examples we walked through. Midland's 50% with residential credit, and then the analyzed fee at 50%. So this is the revenue projections that, if you will, we were projecting.
So you're expecting to get 4 million a year of this, you have to capital cost of 380 million? where do you get the rest of the money?
Yeah, but some of that, money, so the 350 million, we can only collect,
4 million a year, 10 years,
we can't, but some of that is legal. We can only charge for what growth pays for growth, which roughly on the water and wastewater, that turned out about 10% of that need, and roadway was a little bit higher percentage. So that's all we can legally charge. The other money has to come from other funding sources, such as bond, other sources.
Water and sewer fund.
This is just one tool in the toolbox.
Do you run a number based on how many houses, based on how many apartment complexes are going to be built after, when this is enacted, how many hotels, how many, based on a yearly basis?
Absolutely.
I'm curious what the participation were.
Yeah, so this was based on our growth projections that we talked about, that 1.3%. So we've broken it down to how many houses, units we were going to have, how many square foot.
House units and apartment units, and I just don't see a lot of apartments being built this year, or hotels being built.
I have to grab the study to get that exact number, but I don't want to misquote myself. Tom's grabbing it for me. But to also answer your question, if impact fees were to be adopted, one of the things that we would have is we would show that revenue that we're actually collecting on a 6-month annual, semi-annual basis to the advisory committee and say, here's what we collected over the last 6 months. And then we can compare it to our projections. I mean, the hard time is sometimes it's harder to predict non-residential than it is residential from a development perspective, but let me get to that number. All right, we're over a 10-year period, we're projecting 5964 residential units and about 4 million square feet of non-residential units. Square feet.
5,900 single family houses,
No, 5,900 residential units,
including apartments.
including apartments. Yeah.
500 a year,
That's 10 years for a year.
10 years. It's 2 years,
Yeah, roughly 500 a year, but that's
600 a year.
that's a mix of apartments and duplexes, and so each duplex would be 2 units. So.
Right now, we have about 1 million houses in Blue Water, based on the 2
Say 1,000 a year houses, multi-family. A lot of things on
Yeah, we looked at some historical data to come up with this too, and also platted properties and some stuff, but it came out to about that 1.3% growth rate across the city. And those are great questions. Do you have the schedule? Or? We just wanted to make sure that you knew the schedule that we were looking at. Everything's drafted at this point. This is the first stakeholder meeting we had. But we're actually going to have a CIC meeting. We have some representatives here from the CIC tonight, but we're going to meet with them on the 19th. So John would love your input from tonight so they can have that, so that when they have the discussion on the 19th, we have that data point. We're probably going to have this very similar presentation, a short presentation at the end, because what they asked us to see was how it compares to Midland. So y'all are kind of seeing it somewhat first too as well. Then we'll have a council work session to review the CIC recommendations. That's tentatively set for June 1st. And then in order for state law to actually adopt the impact fees, we have to set a public hearing. So on June 8th, tentatively, when the public hearing is set, but the public hearing won't be until July 13th, and potential ordinance July 27th. That's the current schedule we're on. This is just a draft schedule, but this is what we're looking at today. And that, myself and John can answer any questions on the study, and the staff's here to answer any questions. Or any thoughts about what you heard?
Anybody from the committee, Jimmy, Joe, Bill, anybody want to add anything or say
I
anything?
think everybody's asked a really good question. That's why we want to.
Yeah.
That's why I wanted to come and I wanted to listen to them, because they're the ones that are doing it every day, and I wanted to be able to attend the next meeting and say, okay, well, this point was brought up, that point was brought up, and like, you know, Dr. Gold said, some really good questions came up, and we covered it really well.
Chris, you want to add anything, or Steve? I know y'all work in other communities.
Yeah, I think I'll add, if impact fee continues and it is adopted, I'll really urge, CIP to consider, like postponed effective date. Postponed effective date, so as the ordinance is finalized, you know, within 6 months or 12 months to give developers a little chance to catch up, kind of get some stuff on the ground before they're fully assessed. I think really helpful.
And I think Midland did that. I think they had about a 6 or 9 month.
They had it for a single family, a residential.
Yeah,
Not for commercial.
Not for commercial.
So I was just, that's,
Their ordinance wasn't effective date.
there was a longer grace period. There was a longer grace period for residential, that's right, so.
We had that here, state statute, once you get your file, there was not a 6 month effective date after.
No, there was no effective date. They had a longer grace period for residential.
Steve, you got any comment?
Sure.
I'll just add that, you know, effectively what you're doing is charging government now more and more courts in some of your lower income people, another hurdle to getting a home. And you're talking probably about $5,000 per home. And that's that. So you say your baseline house, probably a few $100,000 house. Cost of that home. Made that hurdle much higher for your public employees here that struggle from that you could have to do that. Cost of the pass through. It'll pass through everybody that's ready to home and it's going to be a struggle. You go out of inflation going, but you know you're going to hear that.
Larry?
I just gonna say that a lot of money to a first time home buyer, maybe that first home buyer to affordable housing. See, you're talking years about affordable housing. They should never bring that affordable housing.
But, well, they're in a great point. The council has the ability, and we talked about this at one of our meetings, has the ability to put an exception in there for affordable housing, right? You want-
So there's workforce housing, I like to call it, which is lowercase affordable housing, and there's capital A affordable housing as assigned by the federal government. That is exempt by state law from impact fees. So it's based on median income. I don't know that number, I have to look at the thing. It's based on median income, et cetera, et cetera. It's different for each school.
200, 150, 250.
Don't know.
I'm talking about, these are costs the city's got to incur to improve infrastructure. It's going to hit us someplace. But y'all compare it front to be the bad guys, get it all. That's what I was trying to say. It's coming one way or another.
It will come out as tax on the first time home buyer.
Yes, it will.
And
John, do you have something you want?
Now, my question was along the lines of what defines affordable housing. If it's a medium income area, or that's what we try to do in Desert Ridge. Home buyers come from all over. I really don't know how you define it.
Michael, can you answer that better?
So typically, the definition for affordable housing is defined by the federal government. It's housing that's available for persons earning less than 80% of median income, not to exceed 30 and 40% ratios of front and back end on the road.
Michael, it's going to be around $150,000.
We're not having to build that.
I know.
That's why we.
That's why we're not going to have. But yes, it's going to be people earning less than 30%, sorry, 80% of median income. Depending on what that income is, based on their family size, and what mortgage they can get based on the ratios of either 30% on the front end or 40%.
And I'll say this, is in Lubbock, they have the same discussion that you're having here today. There's no some, Chris was in some of those meetings, is they have the affordable housing, but they also enacted something that the city council has the right to participate in any development that meets other community objectives. So that was the way of saying that this project is, or affordable housing or economic development or whatever, they have the right to enter agreement to pay the impact fees for the development. That was something they put in their ordinance to answer that question, because then they can handle, if you will, workforce housing.
And Odessa already has that $10,000 credit from ODC, but I don't know that any of y'all are in that size house now, are you? No, okay.
I've seen municipalities support part out, part of town, usually the inner city part of town, and have that exemption fee to try to encourage redevelopment down where there is an affordable house. You can do it with
But basically, the way these guys are drawn, they're very capable of being done within each one of those districts.
No, but don't carve out like the inner city, but try to encourage some money going back into those neighborhoods.
And just exempt them completely from
No
the
impact
impact
fees.
fee.
We've had communities do it by service area, like you were mentioning. We've also had communities, if you have an established boundary adopted by another ordinance, you can reference that boundary. Yeah, into an impact fee. Like, it needs to be an established boundary.
But the areas that we're all chasing.
Yeah, we've seen some communities that are trying to redevelop their downtown.
Right.
Call their central business district, if you will, and will create a very specific boundary that exempts to encourage redevelopment in those areas.
So if y'all are writing notes, and I want to know what affordable housing is, and can't remember what Michael said, it's US Code 12745. So if you want to know, that's the code and the law that defines what Michael referenced, and how to look it up.
I think there is a CIP being created, I heard you mention last week about last week. You know, we're talking maximum, you don't have to. We're trying to understand all that, that's not what I have to do. I heard 2,000 numbers going around. So I like to see that encouraging conservation, because that does help keep our housing affordable, not affordable housing, but that does keep our housing affordable. That way we can keep the best of it.
Well, I think our committee, we have no preconceived ideas, and we've been wanting to hear what everybody had, and I'm sure want to get council members to put your 2 cents in. Steve, Mara, any of you know?
The only thing I have to say, John, is that I'm over looking at the water hookups and quick filter. I remember, I got my code plate going great. What was the number you gave? On the 2016 master plan, our hookups are already, we're going to expect it to be 2026. That was as of,
That's like a year old now.
a year old now, so we're already at 2026. So the numbers we're throwing out about the growth are there, and we as a council have to find the money somewhere. We can't float COs forever. There's only so much evidence, we have to pay them off. These give us another way to pay them off. I'm not saying that's what we're going to do, I'm just saying the growth has outrun the city's ability to pay for it and extend those lines. That's fair, John. You agree with that pretty much? No. We got lucky with Line Q, came in way under budget, that helped a lot. I mean, P, sorry. Okay, Steve. But anyway, it came in way under budget, so we were lucky there. But that's not going to happen next time around. Steel prices are going up. If you don't think everything else is going up,
Yeah.
big time.
The federal government said we don't have any inflation right now.
Right, that's zero.
I don't think there's a builder here that would argue.
Yeah.
But agree with that. Mark, did you have something you wanted?
I just had a comment to say, would it be easy to just
start, everybody lives up to the water and the sewer, and that kind of $1 every month, more, we that same amount of revenue, we all this revenue.
We've asked Cindy, I'm not gonna put her on the spot tonight to do the whole rate structure deal, but we've asked her about that. Can you give us a 2-minute? About our water and sewer rates and where we compare with our neighbors and some of those things?
Before she does,
Okay.
I just want to mention one thing, because we talked about that. And, we already have a little built-in increase on those for just to cover some of the general maintenance and things that we gotta have. But then it goes back to basically making the entire city pay for the development in basically one area of town. And so we have, I'm District 3, so we're just across West County, between West County and Dixie, in that area.
Pretty much built out, right?
We're built out. And we're also not real high income areas, for the most part. And so it's going back to like the folks in my district, that they're like, don't keep going up on my rates, and you say to pay for all these new lines, but what's that doing for me? It's not doing anything for me. You're just helping me pay for it. So you can kind of see why the impact fees became something of interest to us, because then it did focus some, just a small amount of that money coming from the areas that are actually utilizing that new infrastructure.
Does that not go to the shopping center, the stuff that you're building?
Well, I would, but my husband doesn't cross Dixie.
Dixie, what are you gonna build for $5 million a year?
Not much. But I tell you, Tom spends that like it's
I understand that you can't build a road, you can't build anything for $5 million a year. Unless you wait till the end of 10 years, you got 50.
That's
And
true.
you got other needs, and none of
But we can use it, that's
So what
all.
are you gonna do?
We can use it for debt service.
Yeah.
On the new CO.
On the CO we got going on. In other words, if we had impact fees today, Cindy, correct me if I'm wrong, I probably am, we could start collecting those the first of the year and use those impact fees to pay for the new line we just give the bid right now. We can pay that debt up. And that's what is the appeal to the council. To some degree, it doesn't just, we don't have to say it up and wait for it. We can use it to pay off the debt. The other thing I want to say to you is that, and if you're worried about the first time home buyer, and Michael gave us that law speak on how you figure out what low income is, I'm not too worried about that personally as a council. Number one, the oil patch is paying, which is huge. Lucero's having to coming in, Lucero needs to go down to $85,000 a job. So new houses, new people coming in and buying houses in Odessa, in the next 10 years, in my estimation, are going to be way above any kind of a poverty level or median income family. We're living a lot more higher paying jobs today than we ever had. And those are outside the world. So
Still gonna need housing that's affordable. I mean,
I understand.
$1,000 is $1,000.
That plan was going to last 5 years. And $4,000 on a house in 5 years, but
And they disappear from the 5 years. All those workers are
no, 500.
500 years permanent.
500.
The houses being built and sold, from what I understand, are for future policemen, fire department, nurses. Some people don't get the fire.
This is a finite number. There is a finite number, but we only have 2 hospitals, and we certainly going to hire somebody to be, or hire more police if we can. It's not a number that's going to jump exponentially. It's not going to jump to 400 or 500. We just graduated class of 21. What do we do? As much as we grow, we want more officers that want to cover the need.
One thing that was mentioned is what I was just thinking your perspective of maybe what other cities have done with their impact fee funds. So that was the question. Debt service is really common. A lot of cities use for debt service. The other one use it for kind of jumpstart projects. That means getting the right way of design. Sometimes that takes a while to get. It's a funding source for that. Others have used it to partnership. So like whether that be with development, like development comes in, they have a funding source to partner. So those are the three most common sources: is debt service, partnership, or I call it jumpstart, design or right way. Those are stuff that I see commonly used. And I also want to add to Chris's comment because I didn't want to misspeak on Midland's ordinance is, and I can show you this, is that single family was supposed to have a 2-year grace period if you platted before the effective date. Before the effective date. Right.
And I think our council has the ability to work whatever they want to in the ordinance about when a plat's effective, when a master plan's accepted, when this goes into effect. So anything they do can have, it's my understanding, they can structure that ordinance within those areas. Yeah. All right, you want to add in?
The only thing I'd say is, you're sitting in the heart of my district right now, and so I have to agree with Deidre, but I'm also concerned, I'm a retired teacher, and I kind of know what those salaries are. And I am very concerned about it. However, as a council, I think it will behoove us to think out of the box and see how we can help those first-time home buyers, or the teachers, the nurses, the people who fall in that area. And I think this gives us some leeway, as I said in the ordinance, to be able to help or to build in some help for those people, because affordable housing or whichever term you use, that type of workforce is very important to me. So I'd be keying in on what we can help for sure.
I just want to ask a quick question, and this really probably has nothing to do with price of tea. But for you guys, because I'm just not that familiar with the building industry, and what the cost of new homes is right now, are any of the homes that you're building under 200,000? I mean, just out of curiosity, what would you? Very few. So what would you guess that average price? And that's probably hard because if you got the mega houses versus the regular residentials, but I mean, what's your guess on value houses?
We're at 275.
So please.
You had asked a question earlier, I can get some specific numbers and then apologies for that. Our lumber prices went up on average, or home prices went up on average about 10% from last year. So that, some of our floor plans went up $24,000, most of that was lumber prices. Those were 1,300 square feet. That's not everyone. We have some just $2 square foot. It's not all over, but on average about 10%.
Steve, what's your median?
I'd say it's slightly under.
Okay, in that same, those upper two.
I mean, I was curious. I really didn't know if any of the homes were really. I don't know if this is probably low income. Okay.
We sub officers, we get all kinds of, we've got school teachers and everything else hired. But the prices in the 6 years I've been out here probably escalated about 40%. And that's just to stay even though at the same time. It's so it's only costs, and it's labor, a lot of labor costs, maybe not so bad right now, but we're giving people material. Just costing right now. I think it's 4 years.
Well, it hasn't changed in many years. We don't really build housing for low to moderate income unless it's got a large amount.
It's workforce housing.
We're building workforce housing.
We're building modern homes for a two-income family.
That's what I'm saying.
It's not necessarily, it's not any very fixed income retirement. But I mean, we're trying to do a certain number of homes a year, and we've got to fit within that window. And that window just keeps on getting raised higher and higher. It'll be a good place. But I think those costs
Any other questions or comments? I don't want to drag this out till dark.
And also, one thing for council in terms of, because I'm the one that created the trade. There's a lot of older infrastructure that's driving, we've got water plants for $100 million worth that we need to do with it. Anyway, but that plant is built with 55 MTD capacity. The plant is built so that we don't have to get land experience that's been developed. The plant is my plant. But I can't tell you how much cast iron pipe we have on the ground. I should be able to, I can go check, but how much cast iron we have on the ground, I couldn't ground before 1960. And I can show you the maps that indicate how many pops we have. And so I'm begging you that, that's another bit concern.
So that would mean people that are using those older pipes would be very, she was talking about not participating in some of the costs. Not just be on the new people who are developing.
That's part of why city council doesn't need to be talking about one district versus another district, because we're all in here together in differing ways, differing problems.
And that's what I meant, we really are addressing that, the city can let you know, we've got incremental increases that's helping to offset that cost of maintenance. You know, because, yeah, a lot of those pipes are in our own districts.
I want to sum up for the committee. We've got a lot of good ideas tonight. We don't have any specific recommendations yet, or we may not recommend anything. We may just say you ought to do it, council, and figure out what you need it to be.
Thanks a lot, John.
Or we may do something like Chris is talking, recommend just a flat rate per hookup. I mean, we can do anything from 0 to the maximum and recommend structure in any different way. And then the council certainly has the latitude to do that. So we just want to get the stakeholders, get y'all's input into what you thought, what your concerns were. And we certainly are going to stir that around. We've got a couple more months of work, but contact anybody on the committee anytime. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for coming tonight.